Hi everyone, welcome to Vulcan Park and Museum. My name is Casey and this is Dr. Nefertari Yancey. Today we are going to be learning about Vulcan. Our lesson today is entitled Birmingham's Vulcan, Art and Engineering Meet Commerce. In this lesson you will learn to describe how and why Vulcan was created. You will also analyze the artistic methods used to create the colossal statue and learn why Vulcan is not only a work of art, but an amazing feat of engineering. Before we get started, let's go over a few facts. Vulcan himself is 56 feet tall, and he's standing on top of a 124-foot pedestal. That equals 180 feet in the air. Vulcan was created in 1904, so to figure out how old he is, subtract 1904 from the current year. Vulcan weighs 101,200 pounds, which is the equivalent of 28 cars or 2,015,936 quarters or 8 elephants. Vulcan himself is made up into 21 separate pieces, all welded together like a puzzle. There are 159 stairs to the top of Vulcan Tower. So Dr. Yancey, can you tell us what was going on around the time that Vulcan was created?
The first decade of the 20th century was Birmingham's busiest. The iron industry was attracting people from all over the world. Skyscrapers were built. The heaviest corner in the South was completed. We built a ballpark, a train station, annexed surrounding communities. It was a time of great civic pride. Vulcan captured that spirit.
Was Birmingham the only city around here where these changes were happening?
It wasn't just Birmingham. Alabama was rapidly changing. Industry replaced agriculture as our main economic growth. This change from farming to factories is called industrialization. Because industrialization mainly takes place in cities, people move from the countryside to cities like Birmingham, a change known as urbanization.
So I've heard about this guy named James McKnight. Can you tell me about him?
In 1903, James McKnight, a leader in Birmingham, had an idea to send a symbol of Birmingham's new industrial urban might to the World's Fair in St. Louis, which was happening in 1904. James McKnight approached many artists and architects, asking them if they could build something. None of them said they could do it. Finally, Giuseppe Moretti agreed to do the job.
That sounds expensive.
It was.
Where did the money come from to create Vulcan?
The Birmingham Commercial Club led fundraising efforts. The Birmingham community chipped in. Even school children gave their pennies.
Earlier you mentioned someone named Giuseppe Moretti. Can you tell us who that was?
Giuseppe Moretti was a very fine Italian-American sculptor. He trained in Italy. In New York, he made ornaments for buildings there. He also made statues for Schenley Park in Pittsburgh. He had a big reputation for working in marble and bronze. The commercial club hired Giuseppe Moretti and gave him just 5 months to complete the job. Moretti was fearless as both an artist and as a businessman. His biographer credits him as the first artist to sculpt with aluminum. Moretti accepted the challenge of creating Vulcan, having never worked with iron before.
Moretti was given just 5 months to make this giant statue?
Yes.
How did he do that so quickly?
First, Moretti made a model. Then he scaled it up and broke up Vulcan into 21 pieces, which were then bolted together with a flange system.
So, who helped Moretti build Vulcan?
There are lots of people who helped Giuseppe Moretti realize his vision. James McWane, who would go on to found McWane Cast Iron Pipe Company in 1922, shared oversight of the casting with Moretti. Charles L. Ledbetter supervised the casting plant. And there was Barney Conlin, described as one of the great molders of his time. He was the foreman. Conlin assembled a crew of over a dozen workers. One of the workers was Fred Buetiker. He recalled working 60 hours a week for 35 cents an hour. staying on the job for 6 weeks without going home during the most demanding part of the project. One of the most important figures in the creation of Vulcan is Moretti's assistant, Geneva Mercer. Geneva Mercer was a fine sculptor in her own right. Educator Julia Tutwiler arranged for Mercer to apprentice with Moretti. Many of Mercer's own works were sculpted tributes to Julia Tutwiler. Thanks to Mercer, we have a biography of Moretti.
My name is Graham Betcher, and I serve as Executive Director of the Birmingham Museum of Art. And I'd like to tell you today a bit about how Vulcan came to be, or at least how he came to be the size that he is today. Now, Vulcan started life as something that would fit on a table, believe it or not. When Giuseppe Moretti received the commission for Vulcan and had to start thinking about what Vulcan might look like, he started, as most sculptors would, in a very small, manageable size, namely working in a block of clay that he would have put on top of a table. And so this is a display that shows the process. So Moretti would have worked with this block of clay and his sculptor's tools, which look a lot like surgeon's tools or even dentist tools, very close to scalpels, things that you can make delicate incisions with and carve with. And he would have formed his concept of Vulcan. He would have then taken the clay model and created a plaster mold. And that is, when you use plaster, and plaster is a liquid substance, you can pour it over something hard, and then when you break open the block, you essentially have a perfect indentation of what it was you poured it around. And from this mold that was created, the cavity that was left when you break open the plaster block, you can essentially pour anything into this mold, in this case plaster, and create a perfect replica of the clay model that one started with. From there, and this is the point when you think about casting in hot metal, in this case iron, you'd have to switch from using a plaster mold to a sand mold because plaster cannot withstand the heat of molten iron. And so when you're casting in hot metal, you have to use sand because it has to be a substance that can withstand those very, very high temperatures. And so a sand mold was made around the plaster cast, and from this sand mold, one could cast in molten iron. And once that molten iron hardened up, you were left with a cast iron bust that looks identical to the original clay model. Quite a bit heavier because it's in cast iron. Now that explains the casting process, but how did it get from something this big that would fit on the size of a table to something larger than life? And that's through something called a pointing machine. A pointing machine is essentially kind of a measuring device that takes something, you can translate something very small into something very, very large. And so throughout the course of the casting process, small components such as these needed to go through the system of being translated into much, much larger pieces. And then once all of the pieces were made large and cast in iron, and so the sand molds would have been extremely large to cast each individual body part in iron, then they could all be assembled to make Vulcan the colossal sculpture that he became. And so, but it's very interesting to think that something as large as Vulcan, the world's largest cast iron sculpture, began his life as something quite small that would fit on the size of a table. Now, who was Vulcan? Vulcan was the ancient Roman god of the forge. He was a blacksmith, and therefore he became associated with metal smithing, not just in hot iron, but in all sorts of materials. And he became a god that was associated with industry and usefulness. He was the god that made useful things for other gods in the pantheon. While other gods were, drinking their wine and eating food and luxuriating, Vulcan was hard at work at his forge, hammering away, making things and proving his usefulness. He often toiled in tough conditions. It was hot, it was smoky, it was, it was dusty, but this did not daunt him. And so that's why Vulcan proved to be a perfect symbol for the burgeoning city of Birmingham. Vulcan was originally exhibited at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis at the Mines and Metallurgy Pavilion. And why was Vulcan chosen as Birmingham's symbol? Because Birmingham was a city on the rise. It was a young city with great aspirations. It had incredible mineral wealth. It had the ability to produce pig iron, which then could be turned into all manner of useful things throughout the country and the world. And so Birmingham wanted to show the world that it was a strong city, that it was a useful and industrious city, it was a hard-working city. And there proved to be no better symbol than Vulcan himself. And from the point that Vulcan was first exhibited in 1904, he has continued to symbolize that same spirit in our city ever since. Now, why is Vulcan standing the way he is? It's an unusual stance. It kind of looks a little bit like a disco pose from Saturday Night Fever. Well, disco hadn't been invented yet when Vulcan was created. That would come 65, 70 years later. Vulcan is actually inspecting his own work. He's holding his spear point aloft to check that the spear that he has just made at his anvil with his hammer is well made, straight, and will do the job. And so this symbolizes the quality craftsmanship that Vulcan embodies. And that's something that Birmingham also wanted to convey to the world, that not only was Birmingham a city where things could be made, but Birmingham was a city where things could be made well. Now, how did Vulcan get to Red Mountain? After Vulcan came back from the 1904 World's Fair, the sculpture sat in pieces on the edge of the railroad tracks. Someone had forgotten to pay their rail freight bill, and so it was not reassembled until a while later when it was eventually brought to the Alabama State Fairgrounds and reassembled. At some point, Vulcan was painted flesh color and was essentially served as a large-scale advertising piece for everything from paint to pickles to Coca-Cola. The spear point was removed, and at one point Vulcan was holding onto an ice cream cone, another point a Coca-Cola bottle. Eventually, folks got the idea that maybe this wasn't the best use of this important sculpture. Although, to be sure, Vulcan had become a popular attraction at the fairgrounds here in Birmingham. So in the 1930s, an idea was hatched to bring Vulcan up to Red Mountain, where everyone throughout the city could see him essentially standing atop the mountain, with a little bit of help from a really incredible sandstone pedestal that was carved by master stone cutters, each individual block cut by hand and then assembled to create this massive tower, which makes it even easier to see Vulcan from a distance. After great efforts from the stone carvers and all of the individuals involved in reassembling the sculpture on top of this massive pedestal, Vulcan was dedicated or rededicated with great fanfare in May of 1939. This is one of the best shots that you can see of Vulcan because it is rare that you have a sculpture in the same place where you can see some of the raw materials from which it was made. And so what you can clearly see Vulcan standing majestically atop of Red Mountain, but just behind me is a cut of the big seam, this incredibly long vein of hematite or iron ore. And it's unmistakable because of its redness, which gives the space that we're standing its name, Red Mountain.
What happened to Vulcan after the World's Fair was over?
Vulcan was a hit at the St. Louis World's Fair. Other cities wanted a piece of the Iron Man. San Francisco offered to purchase him to place him in the Bay as their answer to the Statue of Liberty. Portland wanted Vulcan to headline in their World's Fair.
So if Vulcan did not go to San Francisco or Portland, what happened to him after the World's Fair?
Vulcan was shipped back to Birmingham and dumped by the side of a railroad track. He was then installed at the state fairgrounds, but he was installed incorrectly. His spear point was missing and his right arm was attached incorrectly. His hand was rented out to display Coca-Cola bottles, jars of Heinz pickles, all manners of products, ice cream cones, and he even at one point advertised overalls.
So he was at the state fairgrounds, but now he's here at this park. How did he get here?
This park is a Works Progress Administration Park. The park was built during a difficult time known as the Great Depression, when people were out of work and not much iron was being made in Birmingham. Birmingham was hit harder than any other city in America. To help people get back to work, President Franklin Roosevelt started public works projects all over the country. One of these projects was Vulcan Park. The pedestal Vulcan stands on was completed in 1938. Vulcan was brought piece by piece along the Birmingham Mineral Railroad and lifted by crane to where he stands now.
We know that a man named Tom Joy and members of the Kiwanis Club helped pay for the park. What was the opening of the park like?
Vulcan Park opened in 1939 to much public fanfare. The dedication ceremony included a pageant with a cast of 1,200 on 4 stages, accompanied by a 12-piece orchestra. Sponsors of the printed program included Black-owned businesses. This is striking. From its opening until desegregation in the 1960s, Black citizens would be allowed to visit Vulcan Park only on select days.
When Vulcan was originally created, he held a spear, and he holds that spear today. But I know that at one time he held a torch. Can you tell me about the torch?
Automobile travel was taking off after World War II. Vulcan would fulfill another role, that of reminder to drive safely. In 1946, the Junior Chamber of Commerce decided that Vulcan should have a neon torch in his hand rather than the spear point. When that neon torch glowed green, it meant that there had been no traffic fatalities. And when it glowed red, it meant that there had been a traffic fatality within the past 24 hours.
This park is such a beautiful example of Works Progress Administration design. I know things changed in 1971. Can you tell me what happened?
In 1971, this tower was clad in Alabama marble and the building looked very futuristic. But by 1999, Vulcan Park was dated and Vulcan himself had structural damage. That's when the city once again rallied. The Vulcan Park Foundation was formed. They raised $15 million. Restorers stripped off the space-age marble and rebuilt the sandstone pedestal. They gave Vulcan a skeleton. Inside of Vulcan looks like this. Okay, so let's review. How tall is Vulcan?
Vulcan is 56 feet tall.
How much does he weigh?
He weighs 101,200 pounds.
How many pieces is Vulcan in?
Vulcan's body is in 21 pieces.
Who made Vulcan?
Vulcan was created by Giuseppe Moretti and many other workers.
Who was Geneva Mercer?
Geneva Mercer was Moretti's assistant, a very important sculptor.
Where was Vulcan first exhibited?
Vulcan was first displayed at St. Louis at the World's Fair in 1904.
Last question. What was happening in Birmingham and Alabama when Vulcan was created?
A lot. In 1904, industrialization and urbanization were changing the entire state.